What is going on, guys? You see me wearing a sweater, so it must be time for some functional anatomy, and today we're going to talk about the pelvis and the hips. So the pelvis and the hips move a little bit different, so that's why we're going to talk about them separately, but both in this video. So if we're looking at the hips and the sagittal plane, we can actually tilt the hips front and back, and that is called anterior pelvic tilt if our hips move forward, and posterior pelvic tilt if our hips move backwards. Now, if we're talking about tilting sideways, that is something that's done in the frontal plane. So for anterior pelvic tilt, the primary muscle that is going to initiate that is the iliacus. So the iliacus is part of the hip flexors and is laying deep within your pelvis and connects to your femur. The next muscle that we have is surprisingly laying at the back of our body, and it's called spinal erector, because if we're doing anterior pelvic tilt, you're actually contracting on two sides, so the front of the legs and the back of your back. The next muscle that we're going to use for anterior pelvic tilt is called the rectus femoris. So the rectus femoris is the only muscle of the quadriceps that runs across the hip and the knee. So that one is also causing anterior pelvic tilt. If we want to undo that action and do a posterior pelvic tilt, what we need is the opposite side. So if you see a diagonal pattern here, if we're making a cross and do the other diagonal pattern, we need first all the muscles of the abdomen, so the rectus abdominis, the internal and the external obliques. If they contract, they are going to tilt the pelvis posteriorly. And on the back side of the body, we have the glute maximus and of course the hamstrings. So sometimes you see people stand just on one leg and their pelvis is tilted. Well, that's usually with the muscles that are moving in the frontal plane of the body. The first one that we're going to use for that is the gluteus medius, and that is like the middle glutes. So that one is laying more to the upper side of your hip. Just right below that is the glute minimus, and that one is also going to make sure that your pelvis tilts, and that is an unilateral action if you remember that from the last video. What also is going to help with tilt is the glute maximus, but only the upper fibers of that muscle. So here you see that with movement of the hips, we really mean tilting our hips in the directions that we can. The next thing is movement of the hip joint. So the hip joint consists of two bones, that is the pelvis and the upper thigh bone, also called femur, and movement between those is going to be movement of the hip joint. Because the hip is a ball and socket joint, it has a lot of range of motion, and that's why it's super important to break everything down into the planes so that we can really understand stuff black and white. And then if we have movement that is going anywhere between the extremes, we know that the muscles of the extremes are going to aid in the specific movement that we're looking for. I hope that makes sense. So in the sagittal plane, we have hip flexion and hip extension. So hip flexion is really moving your leg upwards. Hip extension is driving your leg backward. In the frontal plane, we have hip adduction and abduction. In the transversal plane, internal and external rotation of the femur. Let's dive into the sagittal plane. So if we're talking about a hip flexion, we're using the iliopsoas. So that is really one word to say the iliacus. So the muscle that we saw just earlier, and the psoas major, that is the one that we saw in the previous video. So they use like one word to capture that muscle. So that one is going to help in hip flexion. So the next muscle that is going to aid in hip flexion is the rectus femoris. That's the one that spans across the knee and the hip joint. And then we also have the sartorius, which is actually a muscle that runs across your leg. So it runs from the side of your hips, it crosses your femur, and it comes to the other side on the inner side of the medial side of your knee. The other muscles that we use for hip flexion are the tensor fascia latae and the glute medius, the frontal fibers. So the fibers in the front are going to help with knee flexion, and also the adductors are going to help, but they're not going to help in knee flexion from neutral. They are actually going to help in knee flexion from knee extension. So if our leg is already extended, if we're going to neutral, that is the part where the adductors are going to help more in hip flexion. So if we want to extend our hip, we need to use the muscles at the back of our hip. So that is going to be the glute maximus and also the hamstrings. Now, if you're moving on to the frontal plane, where we're going to move our legs sideways, we have adduction, which is bringing our legs from far away back to the midline. And for those, we're going to use, guess what, the adductors. So the adductors are like five muscles that are running across your thigh. They are going to be used for adduction. And we're also going to use the glute maximus that is with the lower fibers. So those fibers are also going to help with adduction. Abduction is the opposite of adduction, and abduction is moving your leg away from the midline. And for that, we're going to use the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus primarily. And then we're going to use the tensor fasciae latae also to do adduction. So also the gluteus major with the upper fibers is going to help in abduction. Next up, we have internal and external rotation in the transversal plane. So internal rotation of the femur is primarily used by the tensor fasciae latae and also with the frontal fibers of the glute medius and the glute minimus. Doing external rotation or turning your femur outwards is primarily going to be done with your glute maximus and also the glute medius, but with the fibers more to the backside of the muscle. So if we're looking at the hips, whether it be the pelvis with its tilting motion or the hips itself with the vast degree of range of motion of the femur, what we see here is one of the most important muscles is going to be the glutes. So the glutes are actually controlling most of the movements of our hips. And that's why it's so important to have strong glutes and to really take care of those pieces of meat. So we're sitting so much and we're making those glutes very weak, and that's how you see that most people have an anterior pelvic tilt because their glutes are so weak. So I hope that looking at it from an anatomical perspective, that we can really understand why some muscles are very important to be strengthened and why other muscles are more important to be stretched and to make loose again. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you can now understand how the hips work. For me, it's always been like a mystery because you have all these muscles interconnected. Obviously, there are a lot more muscles, but they're more intrinsic. They're more of those smaller muscles. But these ones that we cover today are really the prime movers and are really going to be the ones that are driving your hip motion. So thank you again so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit that like button, share it with a friend who can benefit from some functional anatomy, and also leave some suggestions in the comments down below. I'm not perfect, I know that for sure because I'm still studying this stuff. So if you thought that something was wrong, please hit me up in the comment section below and we can discuss it further. So I guess I'll be seeing you all in the next video. Peace!